going to do any formal introductions except to hand off to Jennifer Keohane, who is going to be the moderator beginner of this discussion today. So thank you all so much for coming out.
Thank you all, and thank you so much for being here. I know you're not really here to hear from me. I promise I will introduce you to the lovely folks on stage with me here. But what I want to do, and I will introduce myself in a second, I promise, is I want to give us kind of a frame for thinking about how we might approach these poems and these poets. So come with me on a journey, if you will. In an image that's now iconic, 22-year-old Amanda Gorman, clad in a bright yellow coat wearing a red headband, described the hill we climb to an audience seated on the west lawn of the US Capitol, while thousands more watched on television. Being American, she said, is more than a pride we inherit. It's the past we step into and how we repair it. Here, mind you, this was in January 2021, in the close aftermath of the assault on the US Capitol, she asserted the power of action and forward progress sustained by love, strength, and reconciliation. In this poem, she defines events that were long in the past and events that had recently just occurred, and a fractious, ugly election as part of a new dawn. And I think her words have even more resonance now as we confront attempts to use the power of the state to control historical narratives. More on that in a second. Fun times. We're not really here to talk about Amanda Gorman, but she provides a useful example of how poetry itself can craft a vision of history. Or to use slightly different words, how poetry can craft public memory. Let me tell you what I mean by that. Public memory is how a society or a collective constructs a shared understanding of its past. To use Gorman's words, it's something we all step into. It's used by folks in the present in the service of the future as well, to craft a vision of who we are and what is important to us. We find public memory in written text. The musical Hamilton, for instance, reimagines the class and racial dynamics of the founding of the American Revolution. In textbooks, think about the battle over the 1619 Project and how important it is to sort of fix that date of when our country really began. We build public memory in monuments like those to Vietnam veterans or to Martin Luther King, and we curate it in museums. So I'm Jenny Keohane, like Zach said. I'm an associate professor of communication at the University of Baltimore, and more specifically, I study rhetoric. Now, before your eyes glaze over, let me just say, rhetoric is the strategic use of symbols to accomplish goals. So rhetorical critics are interested in what's persuasive to an audience in a particular situation. I'm particularly interested in identification, how we feel called to see ourselves as part of groups. Rhetoricians or rhetorical critics often study memory texts. So they ask questions like, how do museums and memorials marshal symbols and tell stories to construct these collective identities and to tell stories about what's important about our past? So that's what I do. I study memory places. I've written essays about the National Museum of American History and how it creates a vision of our history that's primarily founded on immigration and entrepreneurship. More on that in a second. I've studied the Smithsonian's exhibit on First Ladies and looked at how that exhibit uses a rhetoric of glamour to do what I call constrain the power of the role of First Ladies. I've also looked at the Women's Equality National Monument, which you probably haven't heard of, more on that in a second, or the Belmont Paul House, and I've written about the newest monument just off the National Mall to Eisenhower. Okay. Hopefully I've convinced you that I know a little bit about public memory, but let me tell you about something I don't know very much about: poetry. I haven't written a poem since probably junior high, but public memory is important to me, and as I encountered the poems that you're about to hear this afternoon, it became clear to me that if public memory is important to me, then poetry should be important to me as well. So what I'd like to tell you or convince you of this afternoon is to think about poetry as what rhetorical critic Kenneth Burke calls equipment for living. Now, Burke is writing about literature, and he says literature is important. It gives us equipment for living, which I think is a really lovely phrase, because it names recurrent situations and provides different strategies for dealing with them. As he writes, a different name for snow implies a different kind of hunt, talking about the ways that some cultures have multiple words for snow. So I submit to you then that we might be well served to think about poetry as equipment for living, and to think about poetry as something that goes beyond just potentially providing comfort in difficult times, although this is an argument that many literary critics have made, but to really think about the way that poetry can bear witness and can actually add and forward public and political discourse. And I think Amanda Gorman is a really good example of that. But we might even be more specific than that. We might think about poetry as equipment for remembering. Remembering tragedy, death, change, hope, so many other things. To give you one quick example, Gwendolyn Brooks' poem of DeWitt Williams on the Way to Lincoln Cemetery, which is a poem that Joseph actually called my attention to, makes a plain black boy from Chicago worth remembering. So public memory then gives us a lens to understand these moments where the past haunts the present, or where the present resurrects the past in ways that can be useful, or in ways that might be potentially problematic, and ways in which we attribute meaning to the past as we seek to make meaning in the present and give us a sense of where we are in the present. So I hope that you come to see public memory as a lens on the poems and the poets that you're going to hear from in a little bit. It's another way, then, for us to engage with their work and to see them in conversation. So if I have to, I'm a debate kid at heart, give you a thesis for the afternoon. My thesis is poetry is one way that we remember and craft narratives about the past, and you will see some real artists at work in a second here. But I'm going to make you wait for the artists a little bit longer, and I'm going to tell you just a little bit more about public memory and why it's important, and I think that's extra important as we think about the now. So why is public memory important? I will give you 3 reasons. The first is that, to use Benedict Anderson's words, it forms our imagined community. In other words, it tells us who we are. I'll give you some examples. Lost cause narratives of the Confederacy constructed the genteel South fighting to save a chivalric way of life. What aren't we talking about in that particular narrative? Slavery. The idea that the United States is a nation of immigrants and is a melting pot, which is a message that emanates really clearly from the exhibits in the National Museum of American History, is a narrative that we hear a lot, but also has some things to say and some very real erasure when it comes to people who were here before, the immigrants and the entrepreneurs. Note its exclusionary nature when it comes to American Indians. But nonetheless, public memory is important because people travel to see it. In architecture critic Kirk Savage's words, it becomes a communal pilgrimage as we travel to see the memories of our ancestors. So that's one reason. Forms our imagined community. Second reason is that it's selective, and so we have to think critically about it. It's selective and therefore exclusionary, not just because the victors write the first drafts of history, although they do, but also because it's expensive. If you think about the National Mall in Washington, D.C., there are only memorials to certain presidents. We've kind of run out of room. Granite is expensive, but so thinking about Jefferson, Lincoln, Washington, those form the bedrocks of what we think as the most important moments and the most important people in our history. I also think that we need to think, as we select the stories that we tell, about how we tell those stories. So my analysis of the First Ladies exhibit in the Smithsonian Museum shows that they're presented in a rhetoric of glamour, which I argue diminishes the role that First Ladies have played in actually really important deliberative public policy events and constrains the memory of women in powerful roles. It's also worth noting that that's the most popular exhibit in the entire Smithsonian American History Museum, and at the time when I wrote that essay, was the only permanent exhibit dedicated to women in the Smithsonian American History Museum. That's no longer quite true. We see women pop up in some of the other renovations they've done. But think as well about the long struggle to fund and to ultimately build the National Museum of African American History and Culture. A long battle, without having that there, big exclusions in the historical narratives that we tell. It's worth noting as well, again, that there's no National Museum of Women's History on or near the National Mall. There is the Belmont Hall House, or the Women's Equality National Monument, which you probably haven't heard of, but that was the headquarters of the National Women's Party, which shepherded the passage of the suffrage amendment, and women affiliated with the NWP kicked off. Okay, y'all didn't. No, there's a spider hanging right by my head. Cool. Cool. So women that were in that house worked for the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment as well. You've probably never heard of it because it's not on the National Mall and it struggles for funding. You don't have to do anything. It can hang out. I'm just, for y'all as you approach the microphone, noting that it's here. But so the point of all those stories is just a reminder that some stories are not prominently displayed in museums or on the National Mall. My third and last point is that public memory is also contested. We debate how events and people should be represented. The Commission on Fine Arts, at first, for example, didn't approve the design of the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial on the tidal basin because he looked too stern or too confrontational, aka too scary for white people. Likewise, rhetorical critic Sarah Vanderhagen writes about a controversy over some of the quotations that are on the plinth and carved into that memorial. The controversial statement was a paraphrase of a sermon where King writes, "I was a drum major for justice, peace, and righteousness," which folks thought was too self-aggrandizing and was not in harmony with the true memory of King. And again, a big debate ensued about who gets to shepherd and steward the true memory of Martin Luther King. But ultimately, the National Park Service got the chisels back out and changed the quote to the tune of almost $1 million. People also push back when they don't like the stories that are told. And we see this in the Trump administration's executive order restoring truth and sanity to American history. In this executive order, Trump writes, "Over the past decades, Americans have witnessed a concerted and widespread effort to rewrite our nation's history, replacing objective facts with a distorted narrative driven by ideology rather than truth." And so again, arguing that any attempt to nuance or to question some of the founding principles and historical milestones in our history is a problem, right? And so the Trump administration is afraid of African American history, thinking that confronting it and reckoning with it makes us weak. So we see in these moments people trying to change the story. The last thing I'll say about the contested nature of public memory is that we also build counter-memorials to recast events when social understanding moves dramatically forward. And the National Museum of African American History and Culture and the importance of building that and building it on the mall, I think is evidence of that. But here's another example. Unveiled in 2003, the Peace Through Unity Memorial, which is at the Little Bighorn Battlefield, commemorates the deaths of American Indians, making their lives grievable alongside Custer's cavalry. We can also think about the reinterpretation work that's happening at Monticello and at Mount Vernon that put the lives of enslaved people who worked on the plantations of our founding fathers front and center. So I've talked mostly about memory places, since that's what I research, but now I want to spend just a couple minutes putting poems and public memory together. Professor Leyva and I have argued that poems can build public memory in their deployment of a collective voice in an essay that we wrote together with our collective voice in the Hopkins Review. And we argue that poems ultimately prime folks for action before they hear the more traditional deliberative political rhetoric. We make this argument through an analysis of Seamus Heaney's Choruses from the Cure at Troy, a lovely poem, and we illustrate how the poem navigates the tensions between the individual and the collective as it tells stories that sort of dwell in multiple historical time periods, the closing days of the Trojan War, the troubles in Northern Ireland, and also our current moment, which is rent with division as well. Professor Leyva and I are also working on a project that investigates the confluence of poetry and memorials, and our inspiration for this, or jumping off point, is Emma Lazarus's New Colossus, a poem prominently displayed on a memory place that becomes and is resurrected regularly in debates over things like immigration policy. Y'all know this one. Give me your tired, your poor. On our campus at the University of Baltimore, we also have a statue of Edgar Allan Poe that has a complicated history. It includes a quote from The Raven that is actually inaccurate. And decades ago, a local citizen felt moved to vandalize, correct the record with his own chisel. The newspaper accounts of the court appearance is like the stuff that the Real Housewives of Baltimore City could be made out of. It's really fascinating. So again, we're trying to pull together thinking about our history, how it's built, how it appears on the landscape, and how it tells stories as we think about public memory and poetry. So let's do some poetry, shall we? I want to introduce you to Joseph and Stephen, our poets this afternoon. And I will do it one at a time, so you have their work and their bios fresh in your mind as you hear them read. So Joseph is going to be our first poet this afternoon, and he has written 5 books of poetry, including most recently, Crushed and Crowned. His poems appear in the LA Times and the New York Times Magazine. He won the 2012 Pratt Library and Little Patuxent Review Poetry Prize for If Mamie Till Was the Mother of God. He's on the poetry board at the Folger Library in DC, and he teaches poetry and creative writing to high school students, aka God's work. In Raising King, another book of his poetry, Joseph uses the rhetorical strategy of prosopopoia, or speaking in another's voice. So in these poems, you'll really hear another perspective on the events that are being memorialized, and in Joseph's focus, he pushes us to move beyond I have a dream to really thinking more about our collective memory of King and drawing in things like letters from a Birmingham jail and some of King's activism on opposing the Vietnam War. In Crushed and Crowned, Joseph centers people from the past and the present whose stories you may or may not actually know. We'll meet, for instance, 2 men killed in the Memphis sanitation strike. And he considers their place in history in these poems. So please join me in welcoming Joseph to read from these 2 books.
Thank you very much, Jenny. And Jenny is so smart and able to really frame this and to explain kind of the role of public memory and especially to connect it to poetry, even though she lied saying she didn't know anything about poetry. She obviously does. She obviously does. And I think that the spider, is he gone?
Okay, is
He's
it
back.
my hair?
Okay. He's gone. I was going to say a couple of other things sort of in introduction, but Jenny really sort of did it, so I think I'm not going to. Except maybe just to give one other example of a moment that's sort of, again, affecting the public memory that is very important to me. At the Stonewall Memorial in New York City, the memorial to the riots of 1969 that are considered the beginning of the modern gay civil rights movement. It took the Trump administration 9 days before they removed the word transgender from all of the signage around the monument. And the monument is basically a park, because really the monument is the street, which is where mostly trans women of color and others, young people, young LGBTQ people, battled the New York City police for 6 days and won.
Is it is it on public record?
It is a national monument.
This is a national monument?
Yeah, Christopher Street and something. But if you look at it, you can find it. It's not hard to find.
That's very fast.
So I just want to dive in. And I'm going to start with a few poems from Raising King, and from Crushed and Crowned, sorry. And this is sort of the negative of the public memorial, or we'll see what you think. But a few years ago, I was invited to give a reading at a library in Alexandria, and didn't realize until sometime before, a couple of weeks before, that the library was named the Martha Washington Library. So I had to go in and offend people on reading poems in a library named for Martha Washington, in memory of Ona Judge. Nowhere in your Book of Common Prayer did it say they had to serve you, the hundreds of slaves you inherited from your first husband, the 50 who came with your second. Even when you moved to Philadelphia, whose laws freed any enslaved human after 6 months, you found it very American to send your slaves back to Mount Vernon in Virginia just before the 6 months passed, thus destroying the freedom of those whose work you could not imagine living without. Even when Ona Judge, your dearest human possession, freed herself from you in Pennsylvania, you could only write that she had not the least gratitude for all you did for her. Not the least. The historians who look like your husband remind us that you freed some slaves in your later years, but they also remind us that it was likely out of self-defense. After all, how safe was it for a woman to run a plantation with hundreds of slaves whose bondage depended only on her continued breathing? If you looked carefully in your Book of Common Prayer, you might find a few words about breath, about God's breath and the soil of Eden. You might find a story about an exodus of enslaved people breathing hard as they fled, about what happened to the breath of their captors. If you look closely, you might even see on Ona's face, or traces of it at least, the face of one who takes his last breath on a cross. One of the most interesting public memorials that I can think of these days is Kehinde Wiley's statue, Rumors of War, which is now in front of the Richmond Museum of Fine Arts. And if you look at it for less than just 5 seconds, you will just assume, or you'll likely assume, that it is a Civil War general on top of a big pedestal, because that's what it looks like. The horse is in the exact position that lots of other Confederate generals are in, and the figure is kind of muscular and upright. But if you look more closely, it is a black teenage boy on the horse, and he has jeans, and his jeans are torn at the knees, and he has Jordans on, and his hair is kind of dreadlocks sort of pulled up on top. So it's a very interesting image. It's titled Rumors of War. On Kehinde Wiley's statue, Rumors of War, for Trayvon Martin. Trayvon Martin could have used that war horse, powerful as a truck, graceful too. The horse might have scared him at first, but I bet once he was on it, squeezing its reins, pressing his legs into its heaving sides, he would savor its power. I bet it would taste sweet to him. On a Florida night when America was being its worst self, Trayvon could have ridden that horse hard. Trayvon could have shown America his boyhood grin, his baptized skin, his hoodie blown back, letting the wind gallop past his ears. Trayvon and that war horse could have become one. The horse's mane whipping his cheeks as he leans over its leaping neck. The horse's hooves would hammer the damp soil like 1,000 fists, like an agony of hands, like a blind man's bullets. And Jenny sort of alluded to this. I don't think she actually used the word elegy, but I think one of the clearest ways that poetry sort of does provide public memory is through elegies. The poet has to decide. The first decision probably is that one about whom you want to write an elegy is someone worth remembering. And elegies are sort of my home court. So here's one. As it always does, for Tamir Rice, a 12-year-old boy killed by the Cleveland Police Department, November 22nd, 2014. 1. Recreation. Something about a rec center should be safe. It should be a place where a 12-year-old boy can play unmurdered. But that is not the way at Cleveland, Ohio's Crudell Recreation Center, because Cleveland hires its police officers without exploring job history, without looking for phrases like emotionally unstable or unfit for this job. Those words could have been read if someone had looked. The dispatcher was told twice by a caller that this boy was playing with a probably fake gun. The caller said this twice. The caller even said he is probably a juvenile, but the dispatcher didn't think that was necessary to tell the officers going to the scene. The officer, who must be able to see into the future, said, "I knew it was a gun." Such wisdom in the Cleveland Police Department hires. So a rec center becomes a slaughter, a past tense boy, a mother torn into 12 pieces of her son's small life. Yet recreation is about as far from murder as one can get, unless one is, a cop in Cleveland. 2, age. When you are 12 and America thinks you are 20, you have no chance of 13, much less playing, goofing, being 12. The police officer radioed to others after shooting you that you were a black male, maybe 20. 3, squad car. The police car jumped the curb and barreled across the lawn toward the picnic table where you played. You stood up and walked toward America, and in 2 seconds you were shot. The police officer later said he warned you 3 times, but no one talks that fast, not even America. America greeted you without speaking, as it always does. And finally, from Crushed and Crowned, let me read the poem that Jenny referred to, also an elegy. And this really is the effort to, in writing a book of poems on King, which I'll read a few from in a moment, discovered Ethel Cole and Robert Walker, and the poem tells their story. They were crushed in the back of a Memphis sanitation truck on February 1st, 1968, which sparked the I Am a Man campaign, which was the campaign Dr. King came to in March and April of '68 to support when he was assassinated 57 years ago yesterday. 1, crushed. Some days America is a jaw, steel-toothed and filthy. Its trash trucks all mandible and maxilla, dripping to devour what falls in, what is not allowed to sit where the humans sit. This jaw especially grins in Memphis, a city of music, whose song sickens even the strongest humans. And these humans work. They rise and dress, show up and do what they promise to do. These are men who should not have to announce themselves to a city, a country that looks past them, their honest glory, a melody Memphis refuses to sing. Memphis only allows them to be grist, used, taken, seen, unseen. This city's cruelty is treble and tooth, shocking even in America, whose cruelty is a jaw we know all too well. 2, Ethel Cole. You were 36 years old, the veteran of your crew, in a city where black trash collectors walked, held on, sat in the back of the trucks, never in the cab, never touching the steering wheel with your able hands. It was coming up to 4:30 in the afternoon, a rainy, dismal day, one of those Memphis rains that leaves the city dirtier than before. As the rain fell harder, you sat in the back, trying not to get sick, trying not to bring a cold home to people who knew your name, whose names you loved. You were one of one. You lived on Danny Thomas Boulevard. You and Walker scooted into the back of the truck. You sat, he stood, when something shifted, something wrong. Metal jerked against metal in this truck everyone knew was in disrepair, and when metal slammed into metal, the ground beneath you moved. You looked up at Walker, whose hand reached out to you. You knew the city hired black men with arrest records because they were less likely to strike. You knew they paid you next to nothing. You worked full-time and still qualified for food stamps. You knew about workman's compensation, but you also knew you didn't have it. All you saw was Walker leaning toward you, gripping your falling hand. 3. Robert Walker. You stood in the back of the truck above your friend Eckel. He was the old man. You knew you joked with him more than you should. When the truck limped toward the corner of Colonial Road and Vern Road, your knees buckled as the truck shivered and shook. You saw Cole slipping backward into something you could not imagine, so of course you reached out to him. Your strong, thick hand wrapped around his thinner, trembling arm. You didn't mind the rain. You just wanted to get home, to 5 children and your wife swollen with number 6. But it didn't take any thought to reach for Cole, until suddenly you lurched off balance too. He fell backward, you slipped forward into a darkness with no name. The grinding came fast, but not fast enough. You knew the truck was in disrepair. You knew Memphis was all about the blues. You knew you were a young man who could not go out this way when this way was unlanguaged. You knew your neighborhood, the city's Douglas neighborhood, was quiet this time of day. Still, you coiled your hands around Cole's arm and you both entered a darkness, a jaw and throat built to swallow you. You were young, but you knew the city would never help your wife. You were one of one. You loved scrambled eggs and the flannel shirt you received last Christmas. You even loved the city uniform you wore to work each day. It meant something to you. You didn't mind being part of something bigger than your body. You just wanted a game of cards. Some days when laughter dared its way out of your mouth. 4. Crowned. You both knew the funeral homes would hold your bodies because your families could not pay, and Memphis, the city that crushed you, would not pay. What you did not know was this. Men would stand up. Men would announce that they were men. Men would walk in silence and demand the right to sit. Men would stand up straight and walk past shocked white families who had never seen their black fellow citizens ask for anything they'd never seen or imagined you could. But something about memory is cruel beyond language. A thought cannot bring a dead man back to life. But our memories of you, your working hands rough as roads, your dismay at a white city's smugness, your punctual work habits, your clean uniforms, these tell us some of what we know, of what we need to know about you. Your deliberate steps still march, even after you died. Your quiet lives speak in the laughter of your children. Your beauty crouches in the shine of your skin after an honest day. These memories are not enough. They will never be enough. But this is how you breathe now. This is how you keep vigil over us now. This is how you live. This is how you lift us all into light. So, and I keep referring to Jenny, but that's a good thing. As Jenny said, I really, quite simply, wrote this book, Raising King, to sort of as an anti-whitewash of Dr. King. You would think that the only thing he ever said was, "I have a dream," and as if he has said nothing sort of more specific or particular than that. And so this book. So I want to start with a poem that refers to, really sort of is built from one of Dr. King's really most clear and searing diagnoses of American culture, what he referred to as the 3 triplets: racism, materialism, and militarism. So if all you think Dr. King said is "I have a dream," it's a long way away from these 3 things and much more complicated. So this is the giant triplets. And I'm kind of reacting to a quote from Dr. King's last book, Where Do We Go From Here? When machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. 1, racism. There are diseases that kill. They do not live in our DNA. They are not the result of a crippled gene. These toxins come from outside us. They exist. They make their way in. We sometimes act like we don't see them. That is one of their symptoms. 2, skin and color, seeing and not seeing. This skin disease might have roots in the tribe. Once we might have needed to fear those who did not look like us. Today, it is a blindness we cannot see. Today, we have built countries on this fear. We breathe it in from just after birth. It takes humility to name it and push it away. 3, materialism. It is as simple as this. Do you think there is enough? Or do you think there is not enough? Our answer creates our creed. It is as simple as this. 4, militarism. It is not just a willingness to kill. It is the willingness to build a kingdom of killing. To not feed your children because a faster missile is delicious. To not care for your elder because we are grateful to a more powerful Humvee. This is what kills, creating weapons in every part of the land, linking jobs to death, so no one says no. 5, these triplets should have been killed at birth, but they weren't. They were allowed to live. Now they ravage the house. Chaos or community. 1, this choice will not be here forever. It is here today, but like all things, it will vanish, just like we will. 2, chaos is stones coming at us from all sides. Chaos is the cut face, the bleeding lips, the broken skin, the purple and black wound beside the eye, the child begging it to stop. Chaos is us picking up stones and joining the war. As soon as I decide to harm you, I am wounded. 3, community is not a world without stones. It is a world where we choose never to throw them at one another. My brother's keeper. This responds to an event in Dr. King's life when his brother, Reverend A.D. King's home was bombed on the outskirts of town. Dr. King wrote about this in Why We Can't Wait. My brother's keeper. I am, of course, my brother's keeper. I have always been my brother's keeper. We have always been our brother's keepers. His home is our home. The bomb on his porch is the bomb on our porch. The men who leave the bomb in the darkness, they're ours too. At the beginning of Why We Can't Wait, Dr. King begins with a kind of a narrative that's not really common for him, describing a boy and a girl in Harlem and in rural Alabama, 1963. 1. A boy sits on his stoop. The house leans hopeless as he is. The rats love him and his family. They know him. He has nowhere to go. He has nowhere to be. He dreams of nowhere. When he wakes after dreams of nowhere, he goes nowhere. His school forgets him. He forgets him. His parents work, but their exhaustion forgets him too. Is he a dream? Has his country deferred him? Can nowhere explode? 2. A girl sits on her stoop, the wood of her home older than her grandmother, but not as sturdy. The field where her parents work is thirsty as she is, but not as angry. She sits and remembers school, but learns now in a field because debts are loud. They shout more fury than books. 3. This is the year young people will sing fury in a melody that hurts, in a rhythm that burns. A flame so hot, fire hoses shove these singers against walls. But those hoses and their water, their judges, their county clerks, their governor, and their country cannot extinguish anything. And let me finish with the last poem in Raising King, which is the epilogue. Martin Luther King Jr. epilogue. 1. Also, did I read any poems in that one? 1. When his body is carried through the streets in a wooden wagon older than his father, when his children look on his lifeless skin with curious grief, when his widow's face waits in stillness, knowing every day from now on can be a bullet. 2. Like the many who killed him, he too knew Jesus, but his life prepared his hands for the silk of wood. He readied his palms for the kiss of nails. He knew more than knowing could say. He bled more than blood. 3, most days, memory is the enemy, but no one wants a memory. We want the touch, the real man. One day, memory is all that remains. We will all burn down to its truth. 4, he knew memory wedded to time makes possible. He knew memory loved into the future can crush a bullet into sand. He knew this was not hope or magic. He knew memory burned into tomorrow is not a certainty. Every moment waits to be used. And using time carefully is our why. Using time with love is our revolution. This is how we raise him. This is how we rise. Thank you.
That was so wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Joseph. I want to introduce you now to my colleague, Stephen Leyva, who was born in New Orleans and raised in Houston. I'm telling you that because I think it'll be important in a second here. I don't know exactly what Stephen's going to read, but I have some guesses. His poetry has appeared in numerous reviews and books, including the Best American Poetry of 2020. He's the author of the Understudies Handbook, which won the Gene Feldman Poetry Prize from Washington Writers Publishing House. His most recent book of poems is The Opposite of Cruelty from Blair Publishing. He holds an MFA from the University of Baltimore, where he is an associate professor and my colleague in the Yale Gordon College of Arts and Sciences. He is also the co-director of, I think I'm going to get this name wrong, the Klein Center for Communication and Design?
The Klein Family Center.
Klein Families, okay, cool. Don't strike me down, donors. But so I think what you'll see in Stephen's work is sort of a different way to remember things that are still important. I'm not sure if Stephen would like this characterization, but I'm going to say it anyway. I think Stephen's poems craft sort of a collective ethos for us to kind of inhabit as we think about the past. In Stephen's work, he brings us back to moments when we encountered public and popular culture like museums and Star Trek and Star Wars, and invites us to remember who we were and what was happening in our collective lives as we watched and listened. I think you'll also find some memory work around the city of Baltimore and what Baltimore comes to mean in Stephen's work as well. So please join me in welcoming Stephen.
Thank you so much. Ginny's been such a wonderful colleague to work with. I learned so much about how to write academic work and how to be in community with another professor and what collaboration can really bring to the imagination. So I'm just always enriched and thankful for her intelligence and for her way of walking us through a door in a way that feels warm and welcoming. I couldn't do a lot of what I do without her support, and I hope I've supported in the same way now that I raised that question. And thank you all for coming today. I know there's a lot going on in the world, and it is not lost on me that you chose to be here with these poems and with thinking about public memory. So I'm going to read a little bit from my book, The Opposite of Cruelty. And the first poem in that book is a poem called A Poem Avoiding Its Own Tour of Force. It has some quotes from the Black national anthem, Lift Every Voice and Sing, which was made from a poem by James Weldon Johnson. So you'll hear, if you know that song, if you know those lyrics, you'll hear them in this poem. A poem avoiding its own tour of force. I could begin with the slate roof of sunset the smog has given us, or the low growl in the throat of a window, the AC unit exasperated. I could begin with the cold color of gunmetal, the aria of the bullet. Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. I could begin in ocean, the gray headstones of dead coral, the only grave markers, or approach the starting line of seashore, the eye is colonized first. Or fire the ceramics in our language. What name does the sculpture give to the clay when it lives in the kiln of a closed mouth? I could enunciate fear not better than any angel and begin with the gray snow on a rose bush, the promise of color. I could begin with the wheat we sow in ether, or the menagerie of jailed poets, pen, pen, pen. I could begin in doubt, true to our God, true to our native land. I could begin in error. I don't care what anyone else thinks. I could begin where I will end. In Ithaca's so gray, when one speaks their name, Baltimore will be the only word anyone hears. I could praise the present tense and begin again. I could condition this vow: I will not love anyone else, but instead begin to hum in your ear, reader, lover, gray stranger. All right, so I'm going to go from gray stranger to seasonal depression. And I'm going to read this poem, Seasonal Depression. It was first published in an anthology by Washington Writers Publishing House called This Is What America Looks Like. And there's a moment in this, it tells a little narrative about something that happened that I wanted to remember right in my neighborhood, so it's very local in that way. But it says something about elegy, and it raises a question about elegy that I think is important as we discuss public memory. Seasonal depression. Give the termites your worry about affording the rent. They too are saying, eat the rich. 2 kids up the block slash a neighbor's tires while the elderly couple are away at a wedding. Why do I even bother to tell anyone who's listening that everyone involved was white except me? Give the newborn mosquitoes their banquet of blood and your worry about diabetes and rotted teeth. Who can say what insectivore is waiting to eat the things that eat your worry? Joy, the long-tongued sloth, or joy, the pitcher plant. Given the insistence on phoenix your tendons return to, given the moles that arrive on your neck year after year from your grandmother, given the fact that every elegy fails to reach its true audience, why do I bother to slash and slash and slash white from this page? There is, in the book, in my book, The Opposite of Cruelty, there is an attempt to answer the question, what is the opposite of cruelty? And not let something glib or trite like simply saying compassion be the only way we answer that. I am suspicious of easy answers to difficult questions and the way that they suggest that problems can be solved fast and without much effort and without anyone else. We need one another. And one reason we need one another is we don't have very good memories. We forget things so easily and we move on so fast. So I wanted to read a poem that's trying to remember something that happened in New Orleans around Katrina. And if you don't know the history of that a bit, along with the vast devastation that happened in the city, along with the erasure of so much black wealth in terms of houses that people owned, there was an incredible neglect in the Superdome in terms of sexual violence, mostly to children. And often, I think, in the narratives of Katrina, that thing that we let happen is swept under the rug, left to the margins. And so this poem tries to think about that a bit. It's called Colonial Ledger. Yeah, they've got two words that are important, or two things that are important that are kind of specific to Louisiana. So if you don't know what a pirogue is, it's just a canoe, a word for canoe in Louisiana. The Superdome is where the New Orleans Saints football team plays, so that'll come up. Colonial Ledger. Some of us grew young with our tongue on the ocean floor, grounded in shoreline and oil. Pirogues raised above our head like astonished eyebrows. The core of the tide's accordion played with our feet. We did not age, smoked, salted folks, nostalgic not for history's art, but for meat. Some of us knew the old beauties, a stone fountain at the center of a garden, verandas wearing the cool wig of the wind, the music in the last room of a shotgun home, common and sublime as a Pearly Thomas streetcar bell at dinner time. That fantasy of city we carried everywhere. Some of us aware we did not have the good sense to love ourselves under the thumb of a FEMA claim. So we ate what we could cook and remember. We left the canoes of youth to rot. We moved away, grew older, and did not age well. Some of us packed our accents in Faubourg Treme. Others escaped to a sister's place in Houston. Too many made survivors where the saints play. Some of us knew and said nothing and were content with laconic trumpet. There is, I just want to read two more from the common sense of, from the opposite of cruelty. And one of the things that anchors this book is a crown of sonnets, a bunch of linked sonnets, in which the title comes from that longer poem. And so I just want to read two of the sonnets in the middle there. They are both sonnets and pastorals. They are written during the pandemic. They're trying to think a lot about what we see out in the world when everyone was isolated. So how does our vision of the natural world change? But I also think about it because there's such a, as I was saying before, pressure to move on from what we remember about the pandemic, people thinking we just had to get through it. And what we remember from that time, I think, is so vital because so much of what we are engaged with now, the seeds were born of that isolation. So this is 5 and 6 from a sequence of sonnets in which there are 7. The title of the Crown of Sonnets is called Halo. So shout out to Beyonce. 5. Curves, summer, the shape of apples. Still a curse breaks. Every amen uttered is a sign of hunger, simple weight. But what of the stem we twist and discard? What of the core made spelt by teeth? What of the seeds black as cold briquette? What of the skin barely holding in its sweet? What of the heat of cider? What of the disobedience required to know anything? What of the evenings alone, hanging overripe in the air? What of being put in a barrel? What of enduring the press? What of the hesitancy to blush? Who can answer for a season of being disposable? What of the willingness to rot? What of the hospitals brimming like an untended orchard? Simple, go and ferment, August announces. Go and caramel yourself, September shouts back. Take a photosynthesis back to its source. The nerve of the sun, the laziest god of all, to go on shining while the whole year's plans have fallen underfoot like forgotten apples. And what of returning to the earth? Fuck it, says the worm, I can eat anywhere. Yes, worm, and feed the fish that make a miracle of replication as the days do cruelly. Isn't there another way to know that we need one another? 6. Cruelty isn't there. Another way to know that we need one another to live. My son, eager to fry an egg for his sister, or he and I playing chess for the first time. I'm no good at this, he says, slumping his cheek in his hand like a mandarin orange in a ramekin. Slip, sweep, the board, astonished and clean, we bust up. Obsolete high school dance moves scuffing the kitchen floor, the kids unimpressed. And having never seen the whiz circle like crows, you can't win? Easy now. Am I too early to every elegy? My wife lifts a half grin, watching the kids pretend to sing karaoke while a sleeve of macarons evaporates like mist. How did we manage to fix a leaking fridge in a basement light socket by the grace of YouTube? And this is the easiest of our questions. We don't talk about the third day without water my mother endured in Texas. What is the opposite of cruelty? We scrub our teeth with any comfort, coffee, laughter, and illuminated text. If not comfort, then the common sense of beauty. All right, so so those are a few poems from the opposite of cruelty, and if you want to read more about the full Crown of Sonnets, you can pick up the book. But I thought I'd read just one poem from what I'm working on next, and the next book is thinking about 50 free black towns in pre-statehood Oklahoma, and imagining what the world would be like if those towns had not been crushed under the Industrial Revolution, wondering what would happen if black folks controlled the oil industry in Oklahoma. In doing research for the book, I ran into some fantastic stories. One of them, a young black woman named Sarah Rector, who was a freedman, so she was a descendant of black slaves that Native Americans had brought with them to Oklahoma when they were relocated. And she was a millionaire in the early 20th century at 11 years old because of oil. And her story is really fascinating. But I wanted to read a poem that's in the December issue of Poetry Magazine called How to Incorporate a Town. And it thinks a little bit about remembering mass relocation. How to incorporate a town. Against the stain of heat, lightning that cracks a fresco of Oklahoma dusk, add this husk of breath. The lawn, a skeletal color. Any remembrance of robin's egg blue or born again vermilion along the myrtle leaf has sunk into seasonal fable. Arkansas river mud, an odd Valhalla of frogs. An endless scrim of small towns along the Indian Turnpike. Guess, if you can, the name of this opera with an empty libretto. What can be said against the stain of mass relocation that hasn't been said by simply weeping? What phantasmal wheat makes the bread ghosts eat? Slim vials of rain arrive at a place where the plains end their protest of dust, where the late birthmark of Art Deco architecture has grown, where Osage hills assuage Ozark mountains, where the Wild Bunch and Daltons gunned a hole in history, where oil transubstantiates. Add to that rain whatever dignity stains. Wouldn't you know, metaphor is the usual method of incorporating a town. Colonial becomes normative becomes Norman, Oklahoma, becomes a university, becomes a universal land grant, becomes a honeycomb of dead bees in the apiary of America. Our Magnum Regina is a coin over each eye. Thank you all so much.
I suppose I should use this, although I don't. Oh, it's on. Cool. So we do have time for questions. I'm going to use sort of MC's privilege and ask the first one, but I hope you will come up with questions for our poets this afternoon. And I feel like I should apologize for. I feel like I sold you a lie. Stephen read nothing about Star Wars or Star Trek, even though that is often his brand. So, but I still think I'm right about my characterization of the poems.
You're right, he's just off brand today.
So my question that I want to kick us off with is I sort of want to go kind of right to the heart of the moment of where we are now in society. So my question is this, and I want to put it together with public memory as well, but in your estimation, what is the role of poetry now in a world where both, I think, art and history are under attack? Why keep writing poems? Why keep writing poems that have a historical focus? And why continue to use the past as a tool in your poet's toolbox when we're being told sort of continually that art doesn't matter because we're not going to fund it, that history isn't important, and that history that doesn't glorify isn't worth telling?
I can take that one.
I want to hear what both of Joseph isn't getting off the hook here.
Yeah. And forgive me for being a little colloquial, but I think to answer the question why keep writing it is because these poems are going to outlive these bastards. I'm completely convinced that good art is more persistent than any rhetorical, any policy, any cruelty that engaged in a policy. Art has a stronger rhetorical force and is more persuasive, which is why it hangs around. And so I think one reason to keep writing it is something that will persist beyond the present regime. And just like if God willing, if we are able to live past that, what do we want to have in our art? What do we want to have remembered? What do we want to say about ourselves, right? We write because we know this ain't the end of all of it, So I think that's one reason I would say, as far as poetry's role, maybe I'll let Joseph handle poetry's role. But the reason to write it, I think, is at the most practical level, because Jenny and I have written about this before, but it imagines a future, right? And so much about what, Toni Morrison said this, like one of the roles of racism is to keep you constantly talking and explaining yourself so that you never do your work, right? So you never ever do your work. And so, but another way to think about that is, the role of racism is to keep you trapped in a present that feels like it will never get better, and apologetic for a past that you can't change, and you never imagine the future. Like it is to dead end your future, because the only future that they want is one in which you don't exist. So that, I think, you write in that moment, or one way to approach that moment is because it's so future focused. It is even in a poem that's pessimistic, inherently optimistic, because it imagines a future.
And I would just, in part, extend that, because poetry and art we have to keep writing poems, keep creating good art, because poetry and art don't just persist, they're also effective. They change people, they change things. And I see this every day with 17-year-old boys in high school classrooms. It transforms people, it speaks to this strange blend of their mind and their heart and their gut. It teaches us how to use language. It's also has, I think, what I really believe in, kind of the organic, almost sacramental power of the truth. And hatred isn't a truth exactly. And so it has a kind of, it's not just going to also be there, though that is true. It's also effective. It has an active power in the world. And we have to use it. And I would say this, maybe this is my new thing, because those people mean it. And if I've learned anything in the last 4 months, it's that it's worse, it's going to be worse than we've imagined. And so I think we have to marshal everything, write everything, paint everything, sculpt everything. We have to unleash sort of an army of art as one thing that helps to sort of work against what really we're watching, which is the destruction of our country, and maybe bigger than that. And just in some practical things there too, besides sort of creating the art, and this is not just for artists, but I mean, I think we have to stop obeying in advance. We have to stop self-censoring. We have to stop all of that. And I know that involves risk, and it's always involved risk, right?
Yeah, I think in some of the ways too, like, I'm very attentive to along with like just calling a spade, like calling out the cruelty, calling out what happens. There's a way too that along with not self-censoring about not speaking truth to power, I don't think we should also self-censor by just naming the beauty that we encounter in our everyday, right? Like in a balance of saying like, well, this doesn't matter right now. I need to be focused on this. It all matters. Like it all matters, right? To be able to say to someone, the fact that you are still able to recognize, that like for me, going to the mall was where I had my first dates. And to remember that in a way that was fond reminds me that I have not been so dehumanized by everything that's going on that I cannot recognize beauty in the world, right? And so those things combine, right? Those things come together. Like I don't want to censor what I say to other people, and I don't want to censor myself towards my own art, right? Like that all of those things are a collective way to return us to our own humanity. And so I think, yeah, we need all of it. We need all of that on every front. I think those things together are quite revolutionary.
And can I add one more thing? Just is that maybe this is the look to the past. I mean, and to remind, especially, I guess I'm, as a high school teacher, I'm there. But it is to remind, especially young people, that this cruel and small image of our country, where diversity is an enemy or immigrants are enemies, it is utterly un-American. It's fundamentally un-American. We've had, of course, other horrible anti-immigrant moments in our history, but we have always understood all you have to do is read 50 lines of Walt Whitman and you can't not come across an immigrant. And so we spend 3 weeks reading Whitman in one of my classes, and the students are sort of like stunned. Do they really read this in schools? And I'm, yes. This is the best of us. I know that we have a president who says, blah, 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 all of this, but this is what America has seen as the best of itself. And there really are people who don't know that.
Two things I want to sort of highlight based on what you just said that really resonate with me and with thinking about public memory are first, that telling stories and writing poems about the past is still future focused, right? I was really struck, Stephen, by what you said about poetry imagines a future, right? And so even as we tell stories about the past, we're thinking about the best of us and what that means for the future that we imagine. The second thing goes to what you said, Joseph, about poetry and art as effective in speaking truth to power. And it's something that Stephen and I wrote a lot about as we were writing our essay, thinking about poems as being pieces of rhetoric. They're not just, and I know you all know this since you're here at a poetry reading on a Saturday afternoon, but poems aren't just pretty words put together for enjoyment and edification. They do things in the world. And so to use the language Stephen and I used, poems are rhetorical. They are symbols that are crafted to have an effect on the world. And I think you're right, Joseph, that they are often very, very effective in ways that political speeches perhaps are not. I have more questions I can ask, but I would like to know what questions you have. I don't know if I should I tender a mic? I guess I don't have, my cord is not long enough.
I can go to mine over here.
Okay.
Let's see what we can do.
I'm thinking more maybe of our recording audience as opposed to, but I can also repeat questions if, okay, perfect.
Thanks. Can you hear me okay? How many people are behind me? Hi, my name is Christian Frock. I am also a writer. I teach a course at New York University's Washington, D.C. Global Academic Center, and the class is focused on expressive culture. And so I was happy to hear you lead with Till, talking about remembering Till, and maybe Till in particular. One of the things I've been trying to talk with my students about in our consideration of expressive culture and the Smithsonian, we can go really deep on the Smithsonian's, is how not to be afraid. And I would love to hear either of you talk about times when your work might have elicited fury or anger, hostility from people who felt that you weren't the right person to make those artworks or those poems, and that someone else should be making that poem. Someone else should be weighing in on COVID. You're not the right person to make a poem about COVID or Till or other MLK. Like, there's so many different ways that any artwork at all receives pushback. And so my finding with teaching, I've been teaching 15 years, is that on the other side of COVID, my students are younger than they were before. Mm-hmm. And they're far more conservative than they ever were. I've taught at very progressive art schools for 15 years. And since COVID, my students don't want to see nudity in art. And so I've had to drop whole museums from the list because they're offended by seeing, contemporary art with nudity in it. And so trying to coax a generation on the other side of the pandemic who've come out on the other side of it more conservative than they would have been 4 years before that, and to being unafraid to take risks and to make artwork, poetry, whatever it is, against the possibility of angering people. Because young people now are very afraid of angering the internet, right, or anyone around them, really. And so I'd love to hear you both talk about, or all three of you really, talk about when you've encountered fury or anger against your work, how you contended with it within yourself, and how you might have put a public response on that.
Thank you for your question.
Well, I can maybe start with this. I don't think that I read any poems from Raising King that were in Dr. King's voice, but there are, as Jenny said, there are poems there that were, and it would take an entire event to sort of talk about, I think, the complexity of that. But I certainly received a lot of pushback that someone who looks like this should not have written really a whole book about King, much less, or even more so, should not have written in King's voice. And I think I understand that some of the complexities of that concern. And I mean, without going into all of it for days, I guess I believe so deeply that the more people who know Dr. King's life and work, the better off we're all going to be. And so I made the choice to go ahead. But I understand some of the difficulty around that for some people. There certainly were times when, again, people who look like me took all of the publishing space away from someone who might look like Stephen. I hope that that's not where we are now. I think it's not exactly, but that doesn't change the history or some of the experiences around that. And just an incident that happened that I just am begun to sort of tell people. A few years ago, my school had a poetry slam against racism, and I worked with the poets, and so we did a bunch of these poems. And I wrote a poem titled, and read this poem titled "When a White Student Spits on a Black Student," because it had happened at a football game that my school participated in. And a couple of days later, coming in the morning into school, and I'm unlocking my classroom door. The door is indoors, and there was a little pile of paper in front of my door, and it looked it didn't look random, it looked planned. And I kind of bent down and kind of began to figure it out. And it was the words written on the paper when a white student spits on a black student, and it had all been torn up. And that was the title of the poem I had read the day before. So I mean, I don't know, it made somebody mad, I just, I think we all have to figure out our, what quality of risk we're willing to bear, and I don't think it.
But one thing about that, Joe, art is supposed to provoke people.
Sure.
What's the guy's name? The guy that died of AIDS, the artist who died of AIDS?
Mapplethorpe.
Mapplethorpe. Mapplethorpe. He was a provocateur, but it was, very good that he came up with his artwork. Some people didn't like it. They thought it was obscene. Well, that's their problem. That's people. Beauty's in the eye of the beholder. I used to work at the Library of Congress, and Daniel Boorstin, that was one of his famous things. He said, art is supposed to shock. It's supposed to shock. Some people are not going to like it, but that's one of the purposes of art, is to shock people. People thought that Lady Chatterley's Lover was obscene, or Ulysses was obscene. They don't do think that anymore, of course, but they used to. No, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, you're fine. Something that came to mind. I think that there's a fear of upsetting people, but there's something underneath that fear that's not being said, right? The fear is not actually. I just want to make space for, I don't ever want to be dismissive about the reasons why people are concerned and careful about that, but they may not always be articulating what is the actual concern. And I think, for students, sometimes, they live in a world that is hyper-visible. They're surveilled all the time. All their lives are digitally documented. They're living in this constant sense of surveillance. And so, this feeling of both I'm seen all the time, and also that I'm invisible, right? So, and oscillating between that, nobody knows me, I'm not famous, I'm not an influencer, I can't make money off of that, versus, oh my gosh, if I do anything, I'm going to get dragged on the internet. And to move between invisibility and hypervisibility, well, black people in the country know a lot about that, that is the same fear. But sometimes, most often white students don't have any socializing about how to navigate that. They don't know what to do. And so out of it, put my head down, don't say anything, and kind of move forward. But just to think about something that, because I've known about Raising King, I've heard Joseph answer these questions before about writing in King's voice. And the thing about it is, it's have you made art you can live with? Can you live with it? Can you live with yourself? Can you live with the criticisms without dismissing them and saying you should not be criticizing me? Because if you do that, you're not in good ground at all, right? Can you listen and say, I still want to, I stand by it, I agree with Joseph. Everyone should know more about King, right? And I would take it an even step further. You might hear in both of our work some devotional language, right? And so if Joseph's coming out of a liturgical tradition, King is a part of that tradition, right? So doesn't he have access to that? He and I write in English. King wrote in English. All of English is available to me, right? This came up a little bit too. A very famous book about Katrina by Patricia Smith called Blood Dazzler. I love that book, right? But Patricia Smith is not from New Orleans. And some people who were from New Orleans felt some kind of way. And their reasoning was, we were still getting our lives together. We were still finding homes when you published that book. You didn't give us time to respond. And I think that response is valid. But I don't think that means that Patricia Smith's book shouldn't have been written, right? It's a framework of scarcity, right? Is there a book by King, by a black poet, that wasn't published because Joseph wrote his? Not at all. That's not true. Not even a little bit, But we need it all. Like, you think Joseph can exhaust King? Exhaust the topic. But to say all that, I'd say all that to say, and in response to that idea of like, art should provoke. I think art can provoke. I think it should provoke us. It should provoke the self too, right? Like, I think the problem is when that provocation is all externalized. The shorthand is to say, like, I don't trust anybody who can't apply their own ethic to themselves. So if you can't provoke yourself, like you're just trying to provoke other people, then that sounds like you're interested in power, not in moving anything forward, not in actually trying to like think through something. And I think, that might be one way, because I'm not sure that I've ever elicited any fear from anyone or anybody being upset about work. I think I can say, hey, I'm this multi-ethnic person, I've got all these different things, like, who are you going to tell me about what I can't write about? But I always approach that from just a sense of compassion, because, when somebody is saying something like that, they're afraid of something, and I don't need to defend my art. What I need to do is talk to them about how do we overcome fear together. Right. What do we do about the fear? And I think we can do something about the fear when we are not cruel to each other. Can you live your poem before you wrote your poem? And if you can, then the way in which someone will approach you is totally different, because you're creating a space that's an antidote to fear.
I don't want to tread on the kindness of the folks that are hosting us. It is 3:31, but maybe one last quick question if anyone has one. I also want to make sure I give you time to come chat with our poets and buy their books, should that be of interest to you as well. Okay, perfect. Well, join me in thanking our poets for being